A single egg could cost more than a day's wages during the gold rush. The true story of what miners ate is a desperate battle against hunger itself. By the end of this, you will know exactly what it took to survive, from the secret of living sourdough to meals of grizzly bear. We will uncover how a simple cast iron pot became a lifeline and why some men resorted to eating weeds. What do you think was the biggest challenge a miner faced at his own dinner table? The journey to the goldfields was a race against the calendar, and a prospector's first and most critical investment was not a pickaxe, but his food supply. A 49er heading overland faced a trek of nearly 12 miles, a grueling 5 to 6 month ordeal. Every single meal for that entire journey had to be carried from the start. Imagine packing your pantry for half a year, then carrying it on your back or in a wagon across deserts and mountains. The list of provisions was a study in survival, not cuisine. Hardtack, a rock-solid biscuit made only of flour and water, was the foundation. It could last for years if kept dry, though you risked breaking a tooth trying to bite into it. Salted pork or beef, packed in barrels, provided essential protein, but the relentless brine preserved the meat at the cost of taste and thirst. Sacks of flour offered the promise of future bread or pancakes, while coffee beans were a non-negotiable luxury, a small comfort against the exhausting days. The sheer weight was staggering. A single man needed roughly 200 pounds of flour alone for the trip. Miscalculations were not mere inconveniences. They were death sentences. Stories abound of wagons abandoned on the trail, their owners forced to lighten the load only to succumb to starvation later. The dream of gold often withered away long before Sutter's Mill was in sight, replaced by the desperate, gnawing reality of an empty stomach. This precarious beginning, this battle fought with weight and rationing, was merely a preview of the even greater scarcity waiting for them in the diggings. If the journey was a trial by endurance, arrival was a lesson in economic shock. Stepping into a place like Sacramento or San Francisco was like entering a city built in a fever dream. The air was thick with the sounds of hammers and hopeful men, a chaotic sprawl of tents and hastily built shacks where everything was for sale and nothing came cheap. The careful rations a miner had carried for 12 miles were often ruined by the time he arrived, spoiled by river crossings or caked with trail dust. His dream of self-sufficiency evaporated the moment he saw the makeshift markets. These were not normal stores. They were dens of opportunism where the laws of supply and demand were wielded like weapons. A single egg could cost a full dollar, a full day's wage for a hard-working man back east. A humble pound of flour, the base of survival, could be priced at 10 times its normal cost. A simple potato became a luxury item, and a tin of oysters was a king's ransom. After the grueling trek, a miner's first meal in camp was a stark declaration of his new reality. It was not a celebration. It was a handful of that overpriced flour mixed with water and fried into a crude pancake on a hot rock, or a piece of hardtack softened in brackish coffee. He would huddle over a small open fire, a solitary figure in a sea of thousands, cooking his meager, costly supper. The exhaustion of the journey was now compounded by the chilling calculation of his finances. Every bite was a subtraction from his potential fortune, a small fortune spent just to keep hunger at bay for one more day. This was the true welcome to the goldfields, a system designed to separate a man from his money long before he ever laid hands on a single flake of gold. And this desperate scramble for basic sustenance would soon force miners to become dangerously creative in their search for a meal. Faced with those impossible market prices, a miner's diet quickly narrowed to just three essential pillars. This was the miner's trinity, a simple and monotonous trio that formed the bedrock of survival: beans, bacon, and bread. Beans were the undisputed champion of the campfire. They were incredibly cheap to buy in bulk, incredibly filling, and packed with protein that a hard, laboring body desperately needed. A miner would soak his beans overnight in his one precious cooking pot, then simmer them for hours over the fire until they softened into a thick, hearty mush. This humble pot of beans was more than just food. It was a daily ritual, a small measure of stability in a chaotic world. Then there was the bacon. It was not the thin, sliced breakfast strips we know today, but thick, heavy slabs of salt pork or fatty bacon, preserved in barrels of brine. This meat was a crucial source of fat and calories, and its salty flavor could make even the blandest meal palatable. A miner would often fry up a piece to render out the precious fat, using that grease to fry his bread or to add richness to his pot of beans. The third member of this trinity was bread. In the early days, this often meant more of the rock-hard hardtack from the trail. But for those who stayed, a new obsession took hold: sourdough. A miner guarded his sourdough starter, a living culture of wild yeast and bacteria, with the same ferocity he guarded his gold dust. This bubbling pot of flour and water was his ticket to fresh bread. Baking it was a constant, labor-intensive chore. He would mix his starter with more flour and water, let the dough rise for hours, and then bake it in a heavy cast iron Dutch oven buried in the hot coals of his fire. The result was a dense, tangy loaf, a small taste of home that was worth every minute of the effort. Every single day revolved around the careful management of these three ingredients. It was a life of repetition, where a pot of beans, a slice of bacon, and a hunk of sourdough bread were the difference between another day of digging and complete collapse. But for some, even this basic trinity was not enough, and they were forced to look beyond the campfire for their next meal. That bubbling pot of sourdough was far more than a cooking ingredient. It was a miner's silent partner. This living culture of wild yeast and bacteria was a piece of domestic life in a brutal world, a fragile thing that demanded constant care. A prospector would mix flour and water in a crock or a tin can, and then he would simply leave it exposed to the air, hoping the wild yeasts floating around the camp would settle in and begin to ferment. Once it was alive, the maintenance began. He would feed it daily with a little more flour and water, stirring the mixture to keep it active and healthy. In the freezing cold of the Sierra Nevada winters, this care became a matter of life and death for the starter itself. A miner would often sleep with his sourdough crock tucked inside his bedroll, using his own body heat to prevent the living culture from freezing solid and dying overnight. Losing your starter was a minor disaster, meaning a return to hardtack or expensive store-bought bread. A vigorous, bubbly starter was a point of immense pride, a sign of a well-managed camp. Using it was a daily ritual. For breakfast, a miner would mix a scoop of his starter with flour to make a thick batter for sourdough pancakes or flapjacks, cooking them on a greased skillet over the fire. The tangy flavor was a welcome start to the day. For a more substantial meal, he might make sourdough biscuits, dropping the dough into a Dutch oven buried in hot coals. But the ultimate achievement was a full loaf of sourdough bread. This was an all-day affair, requiring him to mix the dough, let it rise for hours, and then bake it carefully in that same heavy pot, a process that required patience and skill he never knew he possessed back home. In a world without grocery stores or commercial yeast, that living, breathing pot of sourdough was not just a convenience. It was the very heart of the camp kitchen, a small, fermented key to surviving the hunger of the goldfields. But a diet of beans and bread could only fuel a body for so long. The deep, physical craving for fresh meat drove miners to become hunters. The most common targets were the swift jackrabbits that darted across the plains. A single shot could mean a rabbit stew, a welcome break from the salt pork. Deer and elk were prized, but hunting them required time and skill that took a man away from his claim. Still, the prospect of fresh venison was a powerful lure, and a successful hunt meant meat for days, often shared among a small group of partners. Then there were the more ambitious and far more dangerous pursuits. Grizzly bears roamed the Sierra foothills in significant numbers, and to a hungry miner, a bear represented a mountain of meat, oil, and a valuable hide. Hunting a grizzly was a terrifying communal effort. It was never a one-man job. A group of armed men would track the animal, knowing that a single misplaced shot could mean a deadly charge. The death of a bear was a major event in a mining camp. It triggered an immediate feast, a rare night of genuine celebration. The meat was roasted over large fires, and for one evening, the relentless grind of the diggings was forgotten in the communal devouring of a fresh, hearty meal. This relentless hunting, from rabbits to bears, had a profound and lasting impact. The once teeming populations of game animals around the mining regions were decimated within just a few years. The very land that had promised abundance was being stripped bare to feed the endless hunger of the gold rush. The same rivers that promised gold also offered a more immediate form of sustenance. While a miner knelt in the icy water, swirling his pan in search of fortune, he was often surrounded by a fortune of a different kind. The streams and rivers of California were astonishingly rich with fish, particularly during the salmon runs when the water seemed to boil with silver. A massive Chinook salmon, struggling upstream to spawn, could provide more fresh meat than a dozen rabbits. Trout were plentiful too, lurking in the deeper pools and eddies. For a man whose diet was dominated by salt and hardtack, the prospect of a fresh fish supper was a powerful distraction from the glitter in his pan. The techniques were as simple as the goal was urgent. A sharpened stick could become a spear for the taking. A miner would stand motionless in the current, waiting for a shadow to pass before striking with all his strength. More commonly, he would use a simple hook and line, with grubs or insects for bait. Catching a fish required patience, a virtue often in short supply in the goldfields, but the reward was a meal that tasted like luxury. To cook his catch, a miner would often wrap the fish in wet clay and bury it in the hot embers of his fire. The clay would bake hard, and when he cracked it open, the skin and scales would pull away, leaving behind perfectly steamed, flaky flesh. This was a rare and cherished meal, eaten with his fingers straight from the fire, a taste of pure, unspoiled nature in the midst of his grimy struggle. But this bounty was not to last. The very act of mining began to poison the wellspring. The extensive hydraulic mining, which used powerful jets of water to blast away entire hillsides, sent colossal amounts of silt and gravel choking into the river systems. This sediment buried the gravel beds that salmon needed for spawning and clouded the clear, oxygen-rich water that trout required. The pollution from the miners' quest for gold was silently killing the very food source that had once offered them salvation. The river's bounty, once so generous, began to dwindle, leaving the men even more dependent on their dwindling supplies and costly stores. And when even the fish disappeared, Desperation forced miners to look at the landscape around them with a new and far less discerning kind of hunger. A miner could work from sunrise to sunset and have absolutely nothing to show for it but a full stomach. The economics of the gold fields were a special kind of madness, a world where the price of a basic necessity like flour could swing from $50 a barrel to over $100 in a single week based on the arrival of a supply ship or the rumors of a new strike. This was not simple inflation. It was a form of financial violence. For the vast majority of men who found little to no gold, every single purchase was a devastating loss. Imagine earning $1, maybe $2 for a brutal day of digging and shoveling in an icy river, only to spend that entire day's wage on a single egg, a pound of potatoes, or a small measure of flour for your evening bread. Your labor was instantly converted into the barest means of survival, with nothing left over, trapping you in a cycle of work and consumption with no escape. This stark reality was perfectly captured in a famous, almost mythical, anecdote from the era, the story of the $1,500 breakfast. As the story goes, a group of successful miners, flush with gold dust, walked into a restaurant in a boomtown and demanded the finest meal the house could offer. They were served a lavish spread of eggs, ham, fresh bread, coffee, and potatoes. When the bill arrived, it was an astronomical $1,500. They paid it without complaint, tossing a heavy pouch of gold dust on the counter. For them, it was a display of wealth, a statement that they had conquered the system. But for every man who could afford such a meal, there were 10,000 others huddled outside, eating a cold, tasteless biscuit and calculating how many more days they could afford to stay. This was the great, unspoken divide of the gold rush. It was not just between those who found gold and those who did not. It was between those who could command the prices and those who were crushed by them. The storekeepers, the saloon owners, the shipping companies, they were the ones who built real, lasting fortunes, not from the dirt of the riverbeds, but from the desperate hunger of the men who worked them. The dream of independence died a little each time a miner handed over his hard-won gold dust for a sack of flour that cost him a week of his life. And for those at the very bottom of this brutal economy, even the most basic food became unattainable, forcing them to make choices no one should ever have to face. The relentless pressure to find a decent meal created its own economy of expertise. While one man struggled to keep his sourdough starter alive or burned his daily flapjacks, another saw a golden opportunity. The camp cook was born from this simple necessity, a specialized role that could command a higher wage than many men earned digging for gold. A skilled cook who could consistently turn beans, bacon, and flour into something palatable was worth his weight in gold dust. He freed the other miners from the hours of daily drudgery at the fire, allowing them to spend more time at the sluice box. For a share of the claim or a fixed salary, this cook became the most important man in camp, the one who held morale and physical strength in his hands. These cooks were a distinct breed. Many were Chinese immigrants who brought sophisticated culinary traditions to a land of brutal simplicity. They knew how to stretch meager supplies, create flavorful broths, and turn tough cuts of meat into tender meals. Others were experienced trail cooks from the overland journeys, men already hardened to feeding large groups with limited resources. Their kitchens were ramshackle affairs, often just a larger fire pit and a collection of massive cast iron pots and skillets. The challenges they faced were immense. Their pantries were a study in monotony, built around those same few staple ingredients. A great cook's talent was measured by his ingenuity, by his ability to introduce variety where none existed. He might use wild onions or herbs to flavor a pot of beans, or create a savory gravy from bacon drippings and flour to pour over hardtack. Perhaps his greatest challenge, however, was the audience itself. A mining camp was a chaotic mix of men from all over the world, each with their own deeply ingrained ideas about what constituted a proper meal. An Englishman expected his meat and potatoes. A Mexican miner craved chilies and spices, and a New Englander wanted his boiled dinners. A cook had to navigate these clashing tastes, trying to please everyone while working with the same limited, bland supplies. A cook who could keep the men happy and well-fed was a treasure, a linchpin holding the entire operation together. But for the countless miners who could not afford such a luxury, the struggle for food took a much darker turn, pushing them to the absolute edge of survival. Into this world of hardtack and salt pork sailed an unexpected fleet of flavors. The same ships that brought hopeful American miners from the East also carried immigrants from across the globe, each group arriving with their own culinary traditions packed away like precious cargo. This sudden collision of cultures transformed the harsh landscape of the mining camps into a chaotic, vibrant, and often delicious melting pot. The most immediate and lasting influence came from the north. Mexican miners, who were seasoned prospectors from the Sonora region, arrived with techniques and tastes that were perfectly suited to the environment. They introduced the simple, portable tortilla, a flatbread made from corn that required no oven and could be cooked quickly on a hot skillet. More importantly, they brought the fiery magic of chilies. A miner could dry these peppers, crush them into a powder, and carry that potent spice in a small pouch, using it to transform a bland pot of beans into a dish with real character and heat. This was a revolution in a pot, a way to fight back against the relentless monotony with nothing more than a little dried fruit from a pepper plant. From the other direction came the Chinese, who arrived in vast numbers and approached the problem of food with breathtaking organization and ingenuity. While individual American miners struggled with their solitary pots, Chinese communities established intricate networks of supply and cultivation. They created vast, terraced gardens in the hills, growing familiar vegetables like bok choy and bitter melon. They imported dried ingredients from home through sophisticated trade routes, items like dried oysters, mushrooms, and abalone that could be reconstituted into rich, umami-packed broths. A Chinese camp cook could take the same basic provisions available to everyone and, with a few additions from his secret stash, produce a complex, savory stew that tasted like a different world entirely. European immigrants brought their own deeply ingrained foodways to the camps. German and French butchers introduced the art of sausage making, using every part of the animal to create flavorful, preserved meats that were far more interesting than plain salt pork. Italian miners craved their pasta, and while it was often a luxury, the desire for it created a market. Basque shepherds, who followed the miners to supply them with mutton, brought their traditions of open hearth cooking and hearty, family-style meals. This incredible diversity did not just add new items to the menu, it changed the very economy of taste. A successful cook, as we heard before, now had to be a diplomat of the palate, a man who could somehow weave these clashing expectations into a single, daily meal that would keep a diverse crew of men from mutiny. The American West was not built on gold alone, but on a foundation of tortillas, sourdough, and communal pots of stew that spoke a dozen different languages. While other miners saw only rocks and dirt, Chinese prospectors saw potential farmland. They arrived in California and immediately began reshaping the land itself, carving intricate terraces into the hillsides and diverting streams to create elaborate irrigation channels. In these small, meticulously tended plots, they grew the vegetables of home, transforming barren ground into a source of life. Bok choy, with its crisp stalks and dark green leaves, thrived. Long white daikon radishes pushed deep into the California soil. They cultivated bitter melon, garlic chives, and a variety of beans, creating a bounty of fresh produce that was nothing short of miraculous in a landscape dominated by hardtack and salt pork. This was not a hobby, it was a sophisticated agricultural operation born from sheer necessity and generations of farming knowledge. Where a 49er saw a meal of beans for the 10th day in a row, a Chinese miner saw the possibility of a stir-fry or a nourishing soup. Their gardens became a form of quiet resistance against the oppressive monotony of the miner's diet and the extortionate prices of the general stores. This fresh produce also became a new form of currency. Chinese gardeners would trade their precious vegetables for gold dust or other goods, introducing fresh food into the local economy for the first time. An American miner might trade a day's wage for a bundle of crisp greens or a handful of fresh radishes, items he could never have obtained otherwise. But their innovation did not stop at the garden fence. Chinese cooks were masters of preservation, using techniques that were centuries ahead of the common methods in the camps. They expertly dried shrimp, mushrooms, and various fish, creating a portable, protein-rich larder that could be reconstituted into flavorful stocks. They pickled vegetables with vinegar and spices, not only preserving them for the lean winter months, but also adding a bright, acidic kick to their meals. In a typical Chinese camp, the cooking was a communal affair, organized and efficient. Large woks sat over hot fires, where a cook could quickly stir-fry garden vegetables with a bit of dried meat or fish, all seasoned with soy sauce and spices brought from across the Pacific. The result was a meal that was not only nutritious, but also complex and satisfying, a world away from the greasy, one-pot meals of their neighbors. This self-sufficient system was a testament to a different kind of gold rush philosophy, one based on patience, community, and the profound understanding that real wealth was not just in the ground, but in the ability to feed yourself well, no matter where you were. A single, soot-blackened pot was the true heart of the miners' camp. This was the Dutch oven, a heavy cast iron kettle that served as a bakery, a stove, and a soup pot all in one. Its design was a masterpiece of frontier engineering. The thick walls and heavy lid distributed heat evenly, preventing food from scorching over an unpredictable open fire. That lid, often slightly domed, had a raised rim around its edge. This was its secret weapon. A cook would shovel a layer of hot coals on the flat top of the lid, effectively turning the pot into a miniature oven. Inside, the heat would swirl around from above and below, perfectly baking a loaf of sourdough bread or roasting a piece of meat. This one tool unlocked a world of cooking possibilities that a simple frying pan could never offer. At dawn, it was a griddle for frying slabs of salt pork, the rendered fat saved to flavor the day's beans. By midday, it transformed into a slow cooker, simmering those same beans with a bit of onion or a precious chili pepper for hours until they were tender and rich. In the late afternoon, it became a baker's oven. The miner would carefully place his risen sourdough loaf inside, nestle the pot into a bed of glowing embers, and then pile more hot coals on the lid. The result, an hour or so later, was a crusty, golden brown loaf that felt like a miracle. Mastering this process was a critical skill. Too many coals underneath, and the bread would burn on the bottom before it cooked through. Not enough heat on the lid, and the loaf would emerge pale and doughy. A miner learned to read the fire and his pot like a craftsman, his dinner depending on that delicate balance. This humble vessel was more than just cookware. It was a direct link to a more civilized life, a small, heavy anchor of domesticity in the chaotic, hungry world of the diggings. Every meal was a gamble against decay. That barrel of salt pork, which seemed like a promise of future sustenance, could easily transform into a science experiment of putrefaction. Preserving meat for a journey lasting months, and then for months more in camp, was a brutal science of salt and smoke. The most common method was brining, where large cuts of pork or beef were completely submerged in a strong saltwater solution inside wooden barrels. The salt drew out moisture, creating an environment where bacteria could not easily thrive. The result was a product that was nearly indestructible, but also incredibly tough and so salty it had to be soaked in fresh water for hours before cooking just to make it edible. Even with this careful process, spoilage was a constant, unwelcome companion. A miner would often open a barrel to find the meat covered in a slimy, white mold, or worse, writhing with maggots. The common, grim practice was to simply cut away the spoiled sections and eat what remained, a desperate act that often led to violent illness. Dry goods like rice, beans, and coffee were safer, but they too faced their own enemies, moisture and pests. Sacks of flour had to be kept perfectly dry, or they would become a solid, inedible brick teeming with weevils. A miner would often find himself picking tiny black beetles out of his flour before mixing it with water, a small daily indignity in the fight against hunger. This heavy reliance on preserved foods came with a devastating physical cost. The complete lack of fresh fruits and vegetables meant a critical absence of vitamin C. The body, deprived of this essential nutrient, would slowly begin to break down. This was scurvy, a disease as old as long sea voyages, now stalking the gold fields. The first signs were lethargy and swollen, bleeding gums. As the condition worsened, a miner's teeth would loosen and fall out, old wounds would reopen, and his body would become covered in bruises. In its final stages, scurvy led to jaundice, fever, and death. It was a slow, humiliating demise, a collapse from the inside out caused not by a lack of food, but by the wrong kind of food. The very supplies that were meant to sustain life were secretly undermining it, leaving men weak and vulnerable in a land that demanded immense physical strength. This hidden hunger for something green and fresh would drive miners to take even more desperate measures, looking to the very weeds beneath their feet for a cure. The miner's body began to betray him from the inside out. First came a profound exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure, a deep-seated weariness that made the simple act of lifting a shovel feel like a monumental effort. Then his gums would start to swell, turning soft and spongy, bleeding at the slightest touch. As the weeks wore on without a single fresh vegetable or fruit, his teeth would loosen in their sockets, threatening to fall out with every bite of hardtack. Old scars on his body would split open, and new bruises would bloom across his skin from the most minor bumps. This was scurvy, the hidden tax of a diet built entirely on preservation. The cause was a profound absence of a single nutrient, vitamin C, a substance the human body cannot make for itself. Without it, the very glue that holds the body together, collagen, simply fails to form. It is a slow, systemic collapse. In a land of supposed abundance, men were literally falling apart because their food had been stripped of all life. Desperation forced them to experiment with grim remedies. Some drank vinegar, hoping its acidity would shock their system back to health. Others tried a concoction of molasses and seawater, a brutal purge that only weakened them further. Salvation, when it came, was not from a doctor's bag, but from the land itself, guided by those who knew it best. Observant miners noticed that their Native American neighbors remained healthy and strong. From them, they learned to forage for nature's own pharmacy. They were shown how to brew a tea from the bright green needles of the ponderosa pine, a drink that was surprisingly high in the very vitamin and C they so desperately needed. They learned to identify and dig for wild onions, whose sharp, pungent bulbs provided another crucial dose of the missing nutrient. A miner chewing on a wild onion or sipping a bitter cup of pine tea was not just easing his symptoms, he was engaging in a quiet act of survival wisdom, a lesson passed from one culture to another in the face of a common enemy. This knowledge slowly spread through the camps, a whisper of green hope against the relentless brown and gray of the diggings, offering a way to heal the body without spending a single speck of gold. The land itself became the final grocery store for a starving miner. When his flour sack was empty and his last strip of bacon was gone, his only option was to look down at the weeds sprouting around his camp and decide which ones might keep him alive. This was foraging, a desperate and dangerous science born from absolute necessity. The most common and reliable find was a plant called miner's lettuce, a small, fleshy green that thrived in the damp, shady areas of the foothills. It was easy to identify with its round, disc-like leaves that grew on a central stem, and it could be eaten raw, providing a crisp, watery crunch that was a shocking contrast to his dry rations. It was a humble plant, but it offered something priceless, a direct infusion of fresh nutrients that could stave off the worst effects of scurvy. Dandelions were another lifeline. A miner would dig up the long taproots to roast as a bitter coffee substitute, or he would pick the young, tender leaves to boil as a potherb, creating a sort of rustic, wild spinach. In the late summer, patches of wild berries offered a fleeting taste of sweetness. Blackberries and huckleberries grew in thickets, and a miner could spend an afternoon gathering them, eating some on the spot and saving the rest to mix into a crude, seedy pancake. But this search for food was a deadly serious game. The difference between a nourishing meal and a painful death could be a single leaf or the color of a berry. A man might mistakenly harvest the deadly roots of water hemlock, thinking it was a wild parsnip, or pick the tempting red berries of a baneberry bush, not knowing they were a powerful cardiac toxin. This knowledge was not instinctive, it was learned. The most fortunate miners were those who observed the local Native American tribes, who had lived with these plants for generations. They learned which tubers were safe to dig and how to prepare acorns by leaching them in water to remove their bitter tannins. For everyone else, it was a brutal process of trial and error, where a single error could be your last. A man's survival now hinged not on the weight of his gold pouch, but on his ability to correctly identify a simple weed. That solitary campfire, once the center of a miner's world, began to fade as the diggings coalesced into something resembling civilization. The endless sea of tents was slowly replaced by streets of wooden buildings. And with this stability came a new hunger, not just for food, but for community and a taste of the lives they had left behind. From this longing, the boomtown eatery was born. The first step up from a personal cookfire was the boarding house. These were often family-run affairs, where a miner could pay a monthly fee for a cot, laundry service, and most importantly, a seat at a common table for 2 or 3 meals a day. For a man exhausted from a day in the diggings, The simple act of sitting down to a meal he did not have to cook himself was a profound luxury. The food was still simple, built around the familiar pillars of beans, bacon, and sourdough, but it was prepared in larger quantities and with a touch more skill. A good boarding house cook could become locally famous, her table a coveted spot that offered not just calories, but a fleeting sense of home. From these humble beginnings sprang the true restaurants, establishments founded by entrepreneurs who saw that a miner's deepest need was often for comfort, not just sustenance. These pioneers were a diverse lot. A failed prospector might use his last few dollars to buy a stove and open a hash house, serving cheap, quick meals to men on their way to the claims. A Chinese immigrant, barred from many mining claims by prejudice, could build a thriving business by opening a restaurant that offered familiar, flavorful dishes to his countrymen and, eventually, to curious Americans willing to try something new. Then there were the ambitious chefs from San Francisco or the East Coast who arrived with fine china and elaborate menus, targeting the newly wealthy. These high-end establishments were theaters of consumption. A miner who had hit a rich vein could walk into such a place and order oysters shipped on ice from the Atlantic, French champagne, and a multi-course dinner featuring exotic delicacies. The famous story of the $1,500 breakfast was the ultimate expression of this new world, a performance of wealth where the price was part of the spectacle. For the vast majority who had not struck it rich, the boomtown eatery still offered a crucial service: a hot, affordable plate of stew and a place to feel, for just a little while, like something more than a solitary drudge. These establishments became the social hearts of the towns, places where news was exchanged, deals were made, and the profound loneliness of the gold rush could be held at bay for the price of a meal. A single successful strike could transform a ragged prospector into a king. For these sudden millionaires, food was no longer about mere survival. It was a public declaration of victory. In the burgeoning cities like San Francisco, they sought to erase the memory of hardtack and rancid bacon with feasts of unimaginable opulence. Restaurants with names like the Iron House and the Parker House became their stages, offering menus that were less about sustenance and more about spectacle. A man could order canvasback duck shipped from the Chesapeake Bay, or a thick steak served with real butter and French sauces. The centerpiece of these extravagant tables was often a pyramid of fresh oysters, packed in seaweed and transported on the fastest clipper ships around the treacherous Cape Horn. Each briny, chilled mouthful was a taste of the East Coast civilization they had left behind, a luxury that had traveled 12,000 miles just for their pleasure. To wash it all down, they demanded the finest wines and champagnes. Cases of Veuve, Cliquot, and Moet and Chandon were unloaded from ships and sold for astronomical sums, their popping corks providing the soundtrack to a new kind of gold rush, one happening in the dining rooms. Exotic spices from the Orient, like cinnamon and nutmeg, once unimaginable in a miner's camp, now seasoned their food. A single meal could easily cost hundreds, even thousands of dollars, a sum that would have represented a year of back-breaking labor just a few months before. For these men, spending a fortune in one night was the entire point. It was a performance of wealth so audacious it proved their journey had not been in vain. They were not just eating, they were consuming their own success, one impossibly expensive bite at a time. While a miner's body was fueled by beans and bread, his spirit and stamina ran on liquid. The true lifeblood of the camp was not water, but a dark, bitter brew boiled strong enough to strip paint. Coffee was a non-negotiable ritual, the essential spark that started every grueling day before the sun even crested the hills. A miner would toss a handful of coarse grounds into a pot of water and let it boil for minutes, sometimes longer, until it thickened into a potent, sludgy liquid. He drank it black and without sugar, not for pleasure, but for the pure, unadulterated jolt of caffeine that would power him through hours of shoveling and panning. This was not a delicate beverage to be sipped and savored. It was liquid determination, a necessary dose of energy in a cup. The bitter taste and the warmth in his hands were small comforts in the cold morning air, a moment of focused calm before the day's backbreaking labor began. When the work was done, a different kind of drink took over. Whiskey was the other great constant, a cheap and potent comfort found in every tent saloon and around every campfire. This was not fine-aged bourbon, but raw, fiery 40-rod whiskey, so named because it was said to kill a man from 40 rods away. It was harsh, often poorly distilled, and sometimes adulterated with anything from tobacco juice to gunpowder to give it a kick. Yet for all its dangers, whiskey served a vital social function. It was a currency for gambling debts and trades, a communal lubricant that eased the pain of sore muscles and broken dreams. A shared bottle could forge bonds between partners or offer a solitary miner a few hours of forgetfulness from his struggles. It was a dangerous escape, but in a world of such immense physical hardship and psychological strain, it was an escape many felt they needed. But there was a third, less famous drink that played a critical role in keeping a miner on his feet. On a sweltering day at the diggings, when plain water was not enough to quench a deep, labor-induced thirst, he might turn to a concoction called switchel or haymaker's punch. This was the frontier equivalent of a sports drink, a simple, practical mixture of water, vinegar, molasses, and sometimes a bit of ginger. It sounds strange to the modern palate, but its ingredients were a stroke of genius. The vinegar and ginger gave it a sharp, refreshing tang that was more satisfying than plain water. More importantly, the molasses provided a quick hit of sugar for energy, while the electrolytes from the mixture helped his body retain fluids and prevented cramping during long hours of intense labor. A miner would carry a jug of switchel with him to the riverbank, and each sour, sweet swallow did more than just wet his throat. It actively replenished the very strength he was pouring into the ground. These three beverages formed a trinity of their own, each addressing a different need: coffee for the wake-up, whiskey for the wind-down, and switchel for the grueling work in between, proving that survival in the goldfields was as much about what you drank as what you ate. Yet even in that world of relentless toil, the calendar held a strange power. Holidays like Christmas and Thanksgiving became sacred islands in a sea of monotony, days when the single-minded pursuit of gold was temporarily suspended for something far more important: a shared meal. The effort required to create a celebration was monumental. Weeks in advance, men would begin pooling their meager earnings, creating a communal fund to purchase a single, precious luxury. A turkey, if one could be found, might cost a small fortune, its price driven to absurd heights by the sheer demand of every camp wanting a taste of home. More common was the prized barrel of oysters, shipped from San Francisco and kept cool in a stream until the great day arrived. On the morning of the feast, the entire camp's dynamic shifted. The usual solitary cookfires were abandoned as men worked together, each contributing what skill or ingredient he could. One man, perhaps a former baker from Boston, would take command of the sourdough, working it with extra care to produce loaves of special softness. Another would be tasked with the potatoes, peeling a mountain of them into a large pot. The most experienced cook, the one with a talent for not burning things, would carefully roast the main prize, Whether it was that turkey, a haunch of venison from a recent hunt, or a large cut of beef, basting it with its own precious drippings. The air, normally carrying just the scent of smoke and pine, would fill with the unbelievable aromas of roasting meat, of savory herbs, and of something that was not beans. For a few hours, they were not miners. They were fathers and sons and brothers again, sharing stories of past holidays in places they had not seen in years. The feast itself was a chaotic, joyous affair, a temporary escape where the bland daily diet was forgotten in a blaze of flavor and camaraderie. That single, hard one meal did more than fill their stomachs. It repaired their spirits, a vital reminder of the humanity that the diggings constantly try to grind away. The warmth of a holiday feast was a fleeting dream in the face of the camp's daily reality, where culinary catastrophe was a constant threat. That precious sack of flour, hoarded like gold dust, could transform overnight into a seething mass of life. Weevils, tiny black beetles, would infest the supply, and a miner would often have no choice but to use the flour anyway. He would mix it with water, trying to ignore the dark specks floating to the surface, baking them right into his bread for a little extra, unwelcome protein. Worse still was the meat. A barrel of salt pork, once opened, might reveal a white, slimy mold coating the surface, or a wriggling population of maggots. The common, desperate practice was to cut away the visibly spoiled sections, scrubbing the remaining meat with vinegar before boiling it for hours, a grim gamble against total loss. The line between a meal and poison was perilously thin. Contaminated water, used for drinking or cooking, was a silent killer. Dysentery and other forms of food poisoning swept through camps with terrifying speed, striking men down with violent cramps, fever, and a debilitating weakness that could leave them helpless for days. In a world without doctors or medicine, a simple case of food poisoning could be a death sentence, as a man too weak to work or feed himself quickly withered away. The most profound failures, however, came from the land itself. When the heavy snows of the Sierra winter closed the mountain passes, the supply routes from Sacramento were severed completely. The same could happen with a spring flood washing out the crude roads. In these isolated camps, the last sacks of flour were emptied, the final strips of bacon were fried, and true famine took hold. Men were reduced to boiling their leather boots and belts, trying to render any last vestige of nutrition from the tough hides. They gnawed on tree bark and dug for roots, their bodies consuming themselves from within. The dream of gold faded into a single, all-consuming thought, a desperate prayer for the sound of a supply wagon cresting the trail, bringing not fortune, but the simple, miraculous gift of food. A miner's entire kitchen often fit into a single canvas bag. His table was a flat rock or an upturned crate, and his fine china was a dented tin plate, a matching tin cup, and perhaps a single, all-purpose eating utensil. This was not a setting for leisurely dining. The tin plate was essential, its metallic surface indifferent to the heat of a freshly fried flapjack or the greasy residue of salt pork. It could be scoured clean with a handful of sand from the riverbank and was virtually indestructible, bouncing back into shape after being crushed in a pack. The tin cups served just as many roles, holding that thick, bitter coffee in the morning, a measure of water from the creek at noon, and a pour of harsh whiskey at night. But the most personal and versatile tool was the knife, and for many, that meant a Bowie knife. This was not a delicate eating instrument. Its heavy, cleaver-like blade was designed for survival, yet at mealtime, it became an extension of the miner's hand. He would use its sharp point to spear a piece of meat from the communal pot. its broad edge to slice through a tough piece of hardtack, and its sturdy spine to spread a precious bit of fat onto his bread. The same blade that might skin a rabbit or whittle a tent peg would then be wiped clean on a pant leg and used to carry food directly to his mouth. There was no time for ceremony here. A meal was a functional refueling, a hurried pause between long shifts of exhausting labor. He would crouch by his fire, balancing the tin plate on his knee, eating quickly with his hands or with that one trusted blade, always aware that the light was fading and the river, with its elusive promise of gold, was still waiting. This was dining stripped to its absolute essentials, where every object had to earn its keep, and elegance was measured only by efficiency. Gold dust and coins were often useless in a remote canyon miles from the nearest bank. In these isolated camps, real value was measured not in dollars, but in the weight of a flour sack or the heft of a side of bacon. Food was the original gold standard of the diggings, a tangible currency you could eat if your luck ran out. A man needing his boots mended might pay the cobbler with a pound of coffee beans. A miner wanting to buy a partner's share of a promising claim could offer 200 pounds of flour and a slab of salt pork to seal the deal. Even a doctor's services were often settled with a barrel of potatoes or a precious jar of pickles. This barter economy created a world where prices were wildly unstable. The same sack of flour that was worth $10 in a well-supplied camp could be valued at 10 times that amount just 50 miles away in a settlement cut off by a snowstorm or a washed-out trail. A pound of bacon might purchase a full day of a blacksmith's labor one week, and only a few hours the next, depending entirely on the arrival of the last pack train. This system rewarded hoarding and punished the unprepared. A shrewd storekeeper might hold onto his stock of beans, not to sell them, but to use them as leverage to acquire tools, land, or the labor of desperate men. Your pantry was your bank account, and a run on that bank meant watching your fortune literally disappear one meal at a time. This fluid, often brutal economy of appetite meant that a man's survival could hinge on his ability to negotiate not for gold, but for his next dinner. The relentless efficiency of feeding hungry miners did not vanish when the gold ran out. It simply saddled up and moved onto the open range. The systems honed in those chaotic camps became the blueprint for one of the most iconic institutions of the American West, the chuckwagon. This was not a new invention, but a direct evolution of a proven formula. Just as a mining camp cook had to make do with beans, bacon, and flour, the trail cook on a cattle drive faced the same logistical nightmare, feeding a dozen or more hungry cowboys for months on end, far from any store. The key innovation was mobility. A skilled wagonwright named Charles Goodnight is credited with perfecting the design, transforming a standard Army surplus wagon into a rolling kitchen. He rebuilt the rear axle to support a heavy, hinged box that folded down to become the cook's work table, a direct descendant of the miner's flat rock or upturned crate. This chuck box was a marvel of organization, with compartments for flour, coffee, salt, and sourdough starter, all within easy reach. The same cast iron Dutch oven that had baked a miner's bread now bounced along in the wagon, ready to bake biscuits for the cowboys over a campfire that night. The recipes were virtually identical, a testament to their durability and simplicity. A pot of beans simmered for hours, a slab of salt pork sizzled in a skillet, and a pot of coffee boiled until it was strong enough to float a horseshoe. The cook, now called a cookie, held the same position of immense respect and authority as his mining camp predecessor. He was often a grizzled veteran of the diggings, a man who knew how to manage supplies and morale with an iron fist. A cowboy knew better than to complain about the food, for the cook controlled not only his meals, but also the flow of information, acting as the camp's barber, banker, and medic. The entire operation was a direct transfer of gold rush survival skills to a new frontier, proving that the real legacy of those 49ers was not just the gold they found, but the rugged, self-sufficient culture they created, a culture that ran on beans and sourdough and rolled on the wheels of a chuckwagon. The Hollywood campfire is a place of cheerful camaraderie, with a bubbling pot of thick stew and a loaf of fresh bread passed among smiling, robust men. The real miner's fire was a much lonelier and less picturesque affair. Diaries and letters from the 49ers paint a starkly different picture, one dominated by a crushing monotony that no film would ever dare to depict. One prospector wrote home in despair, stating that he had eaten nothing but fried dough and rancid pork for 42 days straight. His greatest wish was not for a giant gold nugget, but for a single taste of a fresh potato. Another man described his daily bread as a dense, sour brick, so hard he sometimes had to smash it with a rock before he could soak it in his coffee. This was not a life of hearty, varied meals, but a grim cycle of repetition where flavor was a distant memory, and the goal was simply to fill the void. The glamorous stew pot of the movies, brimming with tender meat and colorful vegetables, was a fantasy. In reality, the single pot most miners owned usually contained the same two ingredients, beans and bacon, simmered for hours into a greasy, salty mush. The idea of a miner sitting down to a different, well-cooked meal every night is perhaps the greatest fiction of all. Their palates were not being delighted, they were being systematically deadened by a diet designed for survival, not satisfaction. How many dreams of gold were quietly eroded by the relentless, grinding boredom of the evening meal. This profound disconnect between the cinematic myth and the historical truth reveals a deeper story, one not of adventure, but of a quiet, daily endurance that tested the human spirit as much as the body. The story of the gold rush is not simply carved into the bedrock of rivers, but etched into the very bones of the men who lived it. Their daily diet was a masterclass in endurance, a relentless cycle shaped by brutal scarcity and raw ingenuity. The basic trinity of beans, bacon, and sourdough was not a choice, but a stark necessity, the foundational pillars that kept a body from collapsing under the strain of endless labor. Yet within that harsh framework, moments of triumph shone through. The rare holiday feast, the successful hunt for a deer, or the first taste of a garden-fresh vegetable from a Chinese plot were more than just meals. They were profound morale boosters that repaired the human spirit. This entire culinary journey, from the desperate gnawing on leather to the extravagant performance of a $1,500 breakfast, is a fundamental and often overlooked chapter in the history of the American West. It reveals a truth far deeper than any single strike of gold, that the real frontier was not just the land, but the daily battle to feed oneself upon it. So we have to ask, what food from that era would you be most curious to try? Would it be the tangy, life-sustaining sourdough bread baked in a cast iron pot, a savory stew made from grizzly bear, or perhaps a simple, crisp leaf of miner's lettuce that could stave off scurvy? Let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe for more historical deep dives.